Hi, in this video, I'd like to give you a good overview of culturally responsive instruction based upon review of the literature as well as personal experience. I want this to be relevant for various classes that I'm teaching, curriculum and instruction, as well as content area reading, for instance. So, first of all, a little bit of an overview of what we mean by this concept. You want to make sure that you are understanding the benefits of infusing the cultural backgrounds of your students into your curriculum, whether you're teaching math, science, English language arts, etc. Find ways of learning about your students, learning about their backgrounds, their culture, home environment, and so forth, and integrate those strengths into what you're teaching. So here's the general definition that will ground our discussion in this video. And I'm drawing on Geneva Gay because she's one of the foremost authors here on this topic. So culturally responsive teaching uses the cultural knowledge, the prior experiences, as well as the performance styles. Notice I'm saying performance style, not learning style, of diverse students to make learning more appropriate and effective for the students. It teaches to and through the strengths of these students. Notice in performance style, I'm talking about ways of expressing yourself, ways of making meaning as well as communicating meaning. That's a very different thing than this theory of learning styles, which I've addressed elsewhere. So here are some important things that are involved in culturally responsive instruction that the literature on the topic broadly agrees upon. It validates the student as well as the student's background and culture as a strength and as something that is worthy as opposed to invalidating. It is comprehensive, meaning that respect and valuing of the student's personal and cultural background is communicated and infused in various ways throughout the curriculum in your own classroom as well as in the school. It's kind of difficult for the student if that student may feel validated in your classroom but then invalidated in another classroom. It is multidimensional, meaning that you communicate and express in a very real way respect and valuing of that student's culture in various ways. Multidimensional means multisensory. It means it's infused in ways throughout your curriculum in math, science, literature, ways of expressing themselves in writing, ways of expressing themselves in communication with you in dialogue. You've allow the student to feel like he or she matters and and his or her culture matters. It's empowering and emancipatory, meaning that the student feels like I matter, I count, I can achieve. It is transformative, meaning that that student feels like whatever his or her background is, he or she can achieve what he or she wants to achieve. So the deficit model is when you see a member of a minority cultural group or minority ethnic or racial group or someone who is culturally different or socioeconomically different than yourself as perceiving deficits based upon that person's background. Um, and it is very damaging because instead of seeing the child's potential, what you're seeing is that child is lacking for some reason that has nothing to do whatsoever with that actual child. And so it can be very damaging to your curriculum. Instead, I would like to encourage you to replace that with an asset-based approach to instruction, which means you teach to and through the strengths and interests and background of that child. Now, in order to do that, of course, you have to know that child's strengths and interests and cultural background. How can you teach to and through those strengths if you don't know them? So we have to have high expectations for that child. Now, those high expectations should be, of course, reasonable to that child's ability level and age level and developmental level, of course. But too often times we communicate a deficit model or a type of lower stereotype based upon having lowered expectations. And oftentimes teachers will think, oh, I'm being kind, I'm letting that child go easy, I can't push that child so hard because that child has had it so hard or whatever. And that those low expectations are poison. You want to communicate that the child can achieve through work. Remember the growth mindset. And we want to communicate the child that we respect the cultural background, we value the cultural background and personal background, and we expect hard work, and we expect the child to achieve. We know the child can achieve, and you need to deliver that message consistently. Your goals and expectations should be very clear and consistent. And you want to create an environment where there's genuine respect, genuine belief, and I mean genuine, I mean real. Children can tell when you're faking. Um, and it's communicated in very real ways. Offer praise, yes, but the praise should be specific to what the child is doing and specific to meeting standards and to the work and the expectations. So children learn about themselves and the world around them within the context of culture. And this gets into, of course, um, sociocultural learning theory. It also gets into, of course, Bonfenbrenner's concepts that we've been learning about too in this class. Students from minority cultures may sometimes feel pressure to disavow themselves in various ways or their cultural beliefs or norms or linguistic practices in order to assimilate into the majority culture as being expressed in the school. And that happens in various ways. For instance, sometimes second language learners may feel pressure to disavow linguistic practices. Sometimes children may not feel like their ways of expressing themselves culturally are welcome in the school. They may feel like the teacher may not value it or the students may not value that. And so, in various ways, that will be hidden. And so that can interfere with emotional and cognitive development. Remember that emotions do play a very positive role in learning. So too does connections. Neurologically, remember that we learn by making connections with background knowledge. And so learning of new information and connecting it to our cultural, social background knowledge helps us to learn. If we have positive emotions and we feel accepted, we're more receptive to learning. On the other hand, if we've got negative emotions, we're less receptive to learning. So you want to vary your teaching strategies in various ways. Yes, you can do direct explicit instruction as being recommended, for instance, by Rise Arkansas in ways that is responsive to uh, to culturally responsive instruction. And in fact, if students of particular socioeconomic backgrounds or cultural backgrounds are being deprived of opportunities to learn basic skills, for instance, basic literacy skills, that's not very culturally responsive either. For instance, phonics. Students need to learn the basic skills involved in phonics, otherwise that's hindering opportunities. But we also can combine that direct explicit instruction with opportunities for cooperative learning in which students learn together from each other, to and with each other, as well as with you. Opportunities for independent work, as well as opportunities for inquiry and research projects. You want to bridge cultural differences of the students in your classroom as well as yourselves with each other, oftentimes through dialogue, talk, opportunities for show and tell, opportunities for the students to teach the class if they're comfortable doing that, and opportunities for whether it is cultural days, attending community events with the students, etc. And at that note, Depending on we all have various lives that we're leading. When I was teaching high school in Central Florida, I was very active in the community, including community events where I knew that my students would be attending, and I got out there. Um, I also was very open about my own personal background. I was very real about that, and so there we would learn to and with each other, and the students knew who I was. Now, your level of comfort about being open about yourself and your own background might vary based upon your own comfort level in doing that, as well as by the age level and developmentally you're teaching. Obviously, I feel more comfortable being open about myself with college students than I might with middle school students, of course. But there's some ways in which you can still be open with middle school students, but just make sure that it's age and developmentally appropriate. I'm the higher up I teach in terms of even college. If I'm teaching grad students or doctoral students, I'm a little bit more open than I might be with undergrad students even. That's you make personal choices, but I am saying that if the students feel like you are genuine and real about yourself and your background, that's extremely important. Don't try to be someone that you're not. That fakeness um, comes across very clearly, and that's not good. Learner-centered instruction can be a very important part of your instruction that is culturally responsive. Learner-centered instruction means that you put the learner at the foreground of what you're doing. The learner is more important than, let's say, staying on pace with a pacing guide. Although you do want to keep up with your pacing guide, there's a fine balancing act to what I'm saying there. Sometimes you might have to make choices about what you cut out of your curriculum, so long as you're teaching the most important things that need to be taught, so that there is time to also focus on the specific needs and interests of your students. When I talk about culturally mediated instruction, this stems from sociocultural learning theory that you've learned about earlier in this semester. Culturally mediated instruction, let me break those words down for you. Culture, of course, means the culture of the student, whether it is music, linguistic practices, religion, culture can be um, communicated in so many ways. Mediated, think of mediation as building a bridge. When we talk about, for instance, you've no doubt heard of conflict mediation. This is when you build a bridge between two parties in conflict through improving the communication between them, improving the mutual communication. And by building those two parties that are in conflict can forgive each other and can communicate, and you can ease the conflict through conflict mediation. Um, Now, that should hopefully help you understand what I mean by culturally mediated instruction. You build a bridge between the student's culture and the instruction that you're doing in the classroom so that the instruction in the classroom is increasingly relevant and meaningful and important to the student. So what you want to do is you want to integrate diverse ways of knowing and understanding and representing information into your curriculum. Now, do that in a way in which you draw upon how the students prefer to know and understand and represent information themselves, and be careful that you're not making stereotyped assumptions about what the students prefer based upon reading some book out there about how you think that students of a particular culture group might do that. Because the reality is that we are all various amalgamations of various cultural backgrounds. And there is not such a thing as one single way in which a person of any particular cultural background wishes to communicate or understand communication, because sometimes people of one cultural background are individuals, of course, and so they might have different preferred ways in which they might want to communicate information. Not to mention that within a very writ large cultural group, you might have extreme variations. Take, for instance, Chinese. Um, Oftentimes within Chinese culture, you'll read books about how Asians or Chinese like to communicate and like to learn. You can find that in all kinds of books. But the trouble is that that will vary based upon, are we talking about northern China, central China, southern China? Are we talking about urban versus rural? Which ethnic group are we talking about? And so it varies tremendously. In fact, even with communication, a person from speaking Mandarin from northern China will oftentimes have a difficult time because of dialect differences, even understanding a person linguistically from southern China, even if they're both speaking variations of Mandarin. So keep that in mind. Don't make assumptions here. Instruction and learning needs to take place in ways that encourage various multicultural viewpoints of your students and include that within your instruction. Learning happens in culturally appropriate social situations that allow those students to feel respected and valued. So help the students understand that there is more than one way potentially to interpret events and actions that they're learning about. Help students understand that their viewpoints matter, that they can draw upon their cultural and social experiences to help them understand and make sense out of what they're learning in your English language arts class, or as they're reading literature, or in science and so forth. You decrease the number of unacceptable behaviors because if a student feels frustrated, a student is more likely to act out. So a student who feels more respected and accepted is more likely to behave in your classroom because they'll feel like this is welcoming. So be careful about things like the hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum is this kind of unintended message that you're sending to a student. For instance, if you're not including um, literature and representation of that student's background into what you're teaching, then the hidden curriculum you're sending is that that background doesn't matter. So be very careful about the message that you're sending. You want to integrate various disciplines in their multidisciplinary teaching, in which you might integrate social studies with English language arts and the sciences. Will also help you, it'll stimulate you to teach in ways that are also culturally responsive because you'll be more reflective about your teaching. You want to use resources other than the textbook because honestly speaking, most textbooks out there are not very culturally responsive. They're written so broadly and so vaguely in many ways. So bring in resources. Sometimes you might draw upon students to help bring in resources, or you yourself might find resources that you could use to supplement what you're using in the curriculum. You can develop a learning environment that is very responsive to and relevant to their social, cultural, linguistic experiences, as well as the community when we think about Bonfim. Be supportive and nurturing while having high expectations of those students. Vary your teaching approaches um, in ways that are appropriate for the students and accommodate for the linguistic backgrounds of your students as well. This might mean visual cues, for instance. You can encourage students to ask questions and seek solutions to problems that they may face in their communities or based upon social cultural backgrounds. Now, at this point, um, something I want to stress here is that Gloria Ladson Billings and others in the culturally responsive instruction literature would encourage teachers to include inquiry and problem-based learning that gets into socio-cultural, socio-economic, and as well as socio-political issues at times. Now, You as a teacher have to make your own judgment in context with your own personal background, your own personal belief systems when it comes to that, as well as the school setting in which you're at. So I'm going to teach this based upon what the research literature says about it, but I also want to respect that you as a teacher need to make your own judgments here. But teaching in this approach is thought of as a calling. Don't teach if you are not passionate about teaching, for instance. If teaching is just a job, then that's kind of a problem. And oftentimes, as students are doing inquiry, students would evaluate their own actions in the context of society based upon the consequences of their actions. As you have students engaged in inquiry-based learning and problem-based learning and project-based learning that we've studied earlier in this semester, they can ask certain key questions. How are social relations in their community constituted? How are power relationships woven into practices that they experience? Um, how do the educational experiences and life experiences that they go through expand or limit their own opportunities to engage in critical thinking? And how can you, as a teacher, help students to develop as critical thinkers? You can even ask students to give you feedback on that. Inquiry-based learning encourages students to engage in projects and critical thinking using research-based methods to engage in investigation. And their findings can be communicated in various ways: digital storytelling, art, research projects, creation of fictional stories. You can be very creative here. So, for instance, oftentimes teachers will have students, especially at the high school level, but you can even do this at the middle school level with sufficient training at a very basic level. Students might take, sorry about the typo, that should be field notes, but students might take field notes. They, with proper permission, might take certain video footage, at least within school or limited settings. Photographs might conduct interviews. So again, you can train students to do this. So, for example, middle school in one middle school classroom, Yu Kyung Sung, she was a sixth grade English teacher who asked students to respond to anti-Asian hate crimes that were taking place, especially in the era of COVID-19, and other forms of racism against Asian Americans, as she was teaching a unit about European Holocaust. During World War II, as well as the experiences of Japanese within internment camps that took place during World War II in the United States. So she was bringing her instruction of ELA interdisciplinary with history and connecting historical events with current day events. Students read texts and they focused on the experiences of Japanese Americans in particular during World War II, bring this up in context with current day events that they were reading about with what was happening in terms of anti-Asian hate crimes that were arising and prejudice that was arising in the wake of COVID-19. And their literacy activities included reading historical fiction as well as picture book autobiographies, creating visual imagery, graffiti boards, and participating in discussions. So you can get very creative here. High school English teacher Tara McMurtry engaged in aesthetic learning theory based artful teaching to enable students to create multi genre forms of expression as they learned English language arts while also learning about, and this was to students who were mostly African American in her classroom, who were learning about uh, English language arts as well as African American English. So students participated in the study of trends of diction as well as hip hop slang, study of writings of language scholars, readings of young adult literature, as well as reflected on various forms of language use. High school English teacher. Jacqueline Kopasinski invited a group of AP students to engage in research as well as informal writing in response to poetry and novels by Latino authors. So, in the process of building literacy skills, students also critiqued conceptions of social class as envisioned in literature they were reading as well as present day. High school English teacher Alice Dominguez guided her 11th grade English class through the conduct of ethnographic research drawing on anthropology traditions in combination with the study of fiction and nonfiction texts. Students read A Raisin in the Sun, the classic play, and they also engaged in thematic analysis of the play in comparison with other nonfiction texts that they read in this unit that was taught by Dominguez. And in the context of that, they also studied the role of law in supporting segregation, and they watched documentaries about segregation and the law. Notice this was again multidisciplinary. She was, of course, working alongside social studies teachers too, as she was conducting this unit of instruction. Students made connections while engaging in synthesis and analysis. Continuing on with Dominguez instruction, students formed their own research questions as they conducted this ethnographic analysis. Students participated in research that involved the analysis of field notes, interviews, as well as document analysis. So you can see you can get very creative here. And this really will deepen students' investigation of various topics that they're studying. Another technique that you can use, drawn on hip hop based education, is you can do what's called imaging. This is a type of instructional tool. It's a process by which students, or in the case of hip hop based education, hip hoppers, will reproduce or evoke images, events, and people and symbols from the past in order to make connections with the present. For instance, on your own, you might watch this video that I've embedded from my own youth, at the risk of aging myself, called Tennessee by a group called Arrested Development, and you might come across important images from the past that bring in proximity and connections with the present day. And you can have students do similar activities yourselves. And this is an activity that you can do on your own, and you can use this to model activities that you could do yourself, where you might have students read lyrics, then you might do a quick write response to a particular question, such as, and you might want to make the question easier for middle school students, of course. You wouldn't use this kind of language for middle school students, but how can you make connections between the lyrics and lived experiences?